Okay, then off we go. Number 7. I feel number 7 is lucky in a series. So welcome to the Data-Centric AI webinar of February. My name is Elena Simpel, and I'm here with my colleagues, Sophia and Ben. We're going to introduce ourselves in a short while. Let me just start with the brief housekeeping that my colleagues have asked me to make you aware of. I also see there's something happening in the chat, but I assume people can just hear me, and I'm going to continue to speak. I also hope that we have switched on the recording, or we will be doing that soon, as we are planning to record the content and share it on social media. We also want to promote it on various channels in various ways, and you will have access to a recording on our YouTube channel. Also, as usual, do use the Q&A tab on Zoom to ask questions. As I was saying at the beginning, this is the 7th webinar in the series. It's not the last one. We had an amazing lineup of speakers so far. And if you take a picture of this QR code, I think it's going to lead you to the place where you can watch all of them. Most recently in January, I was speaking to Chris Johnson. He's a Chief Scientific Advisor at the Department for Science, Technology and Innovation here in the UK. Today we're going to do, for the first time in this series, something a bit different. We thought we would tell you a bit about some of our own work. We are part of the Data-Centric AI program here at the ODI, and over the course of last year, we've worked on a number of projects related to the AI data ecosystem and the practices and stakeholders and resources around it. So today we're going to tell you about data transparency and AI with my colleagues. So at this time, maybe I just give you a chance to say hello as well and introduce yourself. Yeah, Sophia first.
Go first, I guess. So yeah, I'm Sophia. I've been working at the ODI for a couple of years and working in this data-centric AI program over the last year. But I'm also a PhD student nowadays at King's, where I work with Eleanor. I'll hand to you, Ben.
Thank you. I'm Ben Snaith. I'm a senior researcher at the ODI. I've been here for coming up 7 years now, so work on a whole different variety of topics, but was working on the data transparency work with the others.
Thank you, Ben. And as always, I am Eleanor. I'm the Director of Research at the ODI. I'm going to soon celebrate 2 years at the ODI as Director of Research. And I am also, for my sins, an academic at King's College. So data transparency in AI. So we have 3 parts that we're going to go through today. I am going to talk a little bit about the desire or demand for transparency in AI, trying and somewhat failing to define what AI transparency and AI data transparency is, just to manage expectations from the beginning, but explaining the different debates that are going on in this space, both in predictive and in generative AI. And then moving on to Sophia, who's going to give us a great overview of existing approaches, how people in various areas, in technology, in social sciences and ethics, in regulation, approach this topic of transparency. And then Ben is going to walk us through what we have done about it. What good AI data transparency looks like. Okay, so this is me. I should have edited this better. Right, moving on. The demand for data transparency. So you can see where I'm going with this. I think this black box picture is going to be as close as I will get to defining what transparency is. But I hope intuitively you're all here because you have heard or you have thought about the need to make technology, in particular AI, in particular technology that has already such a high impact on people's lives, easier to understand and to audit and relate to. Say when we look at transparency as a topic, probably some of you have at least seen at least one of these stories in the media. So there is a lot of talk about transparency and transparency adjacent subjects. And there's a mainstream, a general demand from various places in society for more transparency. And the reasons for that are complex and multifaceted, but they range from a need for experts and the public to understand and being able to mitigate some of the harms that we know AI can create. A need for those who are building and deploying AI systems to understand what the issues are and to be able to do their jobs responsibly and do something about it, either at the time when they are dealing with the data or when they're actually considering whether they should be using an AI solution in that context at all. And then, of course, further down the line when they start with training models, fine-tuning them and applying them. Transparency is often discussed also in the context of being a tool that can help shed light on questions around the rights over the use of various data sources that play different roles in the AI lifecycle. And finally, as in many areas in technology and beyond, there is a link between transparency and trust and public trust, not just in relation to how our data is used or not in AI systems and models, but also in how things are done. What sort of practices and codes of conduct does this industry follow, if any? So here on the right-hand side, we have a range of stories, but we could have picked many others. Some point to issues with some of the large data sets that are fed into text-to-image models. We probably know or have heard about cases where these data sets do contain copyrighted content, but also content that is illegal and disturbing. There's various regulatory efforts underway, and transparency plays a big part there as well. Most recently, you may have heard about Thomson Reuters winning a copyright fair use case ruling against a one-time competitor. I should also say that, at least in my understanding, that's a very specific legal situation in which this decision was made, but there's many other ruling that we're waiting for to shed light on this subject. So besides the discussions that we are witnessing in the public sphere and in the mainstream media, there have been many efforts at national and supranational level to come up with so-called ethical or responsible AI frameworks and toolkits to help developers and users approach the design and the use of the technology in a responsible way. If you analyze these hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of efforts, there's one trend, and that is that transparency is possibly the dimension that appears in all of them, is the most commonly mentioned principle. So it seems to resonate with people's understanding of what ethical technology, what responsible technology looks like. we at the ODI have been doing and talking about transparency as well, starting with some early work. I think this must have been 2023 when we wrote about the lack of transparency around the data used to train foundational models in Harvard Data Science Review, followed by a research project that Sophia led on, where we've done some exploratory work into trying to understand how is transparency, how does transparency work when you look at cases that we know have gone wrong. So we looked at so-called AI incident databases. If you don't know what they are crowdsourced collections of thousands and thousands of cases where some model or an application of an AI model has caused clear, tangible harm. And Sophia has analyzed them to understand not just the requirements for transparency in relation to data, but also came up with some very interesting observations and recommendations for how this sort of incident collection and analysis should be carried out. So I recommend you to go on archive and have a look. We've also published policy positions related to transparency last year, responding to public consultations and other activities ongoing in the UK and in Europe. And we are one of the drivers of an open source vocabulary, machine readable vocabulary, to create metadata about AI data sets, with transparency being one of the main use cases for creating this standard and the associated tools. Now, what is AI data transparency at all? Say colleagues have picked two quotes from ongoing research. The first one talks about data transparency, and you don't need to read the text, but essentially it links transparency and data transparency in particular to personal data. So we're talking about subjects that are affected by how their data is used. And we want those subjects to have access to all information, to information related to how data is used in the process. So this has clear connections to privacy and data protection regulation and related frameworks. Not a definition, but an interesting viewpoint comes from colleagues from PwC. And that resonated to us because in relation to transparency, they state that to be trustworthy, AI systems need to allow people to look under the hood. And by that, we mean to be able to inspect, audit, assess models, but also the data that was used to train them, to fine-tune them, expose the reasoning behind each decision. So that points to explanations, to interpretability, and provide coherent explanations, coherent for those audiences that are accessing that information. And what is very important to us as well, as Ben will explain later on, is that all this information about what is happening under the hood and what the system or the model is producing, is predicting, is generating, should be tailored to those audiences. So there's a question of how do we communicate that information in a way that people can digest it and use it. Now, if we're thinking about AI data transparency, building on these two interventions, there's a few considerations that I have listed here on the slide to wrap up this introduction. So when we talk about AI data transparency, it's clear that we can't just focus on the data alone and forget about the rest. So in our view, there is no data transparency in AI without also considering transparency of models and systems or applications of these models. Then if we're talking about data, and we have unpacked this in great detail in our AI data taxonomy that is on the right-hand side, we talk about training data, but actually for useful transparency for developers and other stakeholders, you also need to provide information about the data that you've used to tailor the model, about prompts, about the reference databases you have used, about canonical lists of filters and dictionaries, about benchmarks data that you've used to evaluate. And then if we're talking about, right, okay, we want to be transparent, but how do we want to do that? For technical and other reasons, you may never have total full transparency or total full transparency for every audience. So that question of what is the right level for different audiences, and then following from that, how to implement that, considering that there's a range of different players in this ecosystem with varying levels of resources. How do you do the right thing for the right audience to communicate that information about what you have done? How have you created that model? How have you used it? And what data have you used in the process? And with that, I'm going to hand over to Sophia. I have absolutely no idea how much time I have used, but hopefully not that much to allow my colleagues to present the actual work. Sophia, over to you.
Thanks. So, yeah, so the question, I guess, that all of this raises is what is currently being done. So the good news is that quite a lot has happened over the last few years. And there's quite a lot for me to say, so I'm going to outline it in a kind of high level and brief way rather than going into depth. So yeah, this means there are all kinds of different key ways of documenting AI data, and I'm going to talk a bit about how they fit together. So next slide, please. So the first obvious form is dataset documentation. So there have been all different approaches to kind of structuring the key information about a dataset all across the life cycle. So this will include things like who's responsible for the content of the dataset, whether key features like whether it includes sort of sensitive or harmful data in any way, the dates associated in terms of when it was collected, why it was created, and what relevant uses might be. So this project, the Data Nutrition Project, actually used the term nutrition label, which I guess is a kind of analogy, kind of demonstrating that their standard is supposed to kind of contain the essential information to allow like responsible use and to allow interrogation of the data sets. So yeah, a range of different approaches with kind of quite different focuses. And of course, the format is important. So these being available and findable in formats that are usable to different users is really important. There being kind of centralized repositories of this documentation. At the ODI, as Eleanor mentioned, we've been working on the croissant standard. So this aims to produce machine readable metadata for machine learning data sets. So at this point, there are hundreds of thousands of data sets that have metadata sort of produced within the same format that you can then use for finding and managing data sets. But we talk about that also in other contexts, so I won't say too much. Next slide, please. So yes, as Eleanor mentioned, model and system documentation are also important for understanding how data is used within AI systems more broadly. So there's a kind of dependency between the two, which I'll talk about a bit more later. So these include sort of non-standardized approaches like tech companies publishing sort of lengthy technical papers, helping people to understand the models that they're publishing, but also more structured approaches like model cards. So I've got this graphical representation of what a model card looks like here on the slide. As you can see, these approaches are often developed by major tech companies, and at this point they're very much voluntary forms of transparency. And the adoption, probably relatedly, has been pretty high. So there are tens of thousands of model cards available on Hugging Face, which is an open development community. So you can go on there and look for yourselves, of course, about what model providers are saying about their models and how data is being used within them. And in theory, these kinds of approaches can be used to embed structured ways of documenting more specific data sets. But as Ben will be talking about later, this isn't necessarily always done in filling out these kinds of documentation isn't always done in consistent ways. So this embedding of data set documentation isn't always necessarily done. To the next slide, please. So yeah, I've talked a bit about voluntary forms of documentation, but there's also a kind of range of other sources of transparency information. So I've got here the Data Provenance Initiative, which is a research project undertaken by a group of interdisciplinary researchers where they produced a central repository with information that they'd managed to ascertain about a huge range of data sets that were used to train large language models. So that's useful both for identifying the specific data sets that have been used to train a specific model, but also to gather a sense of the current landscape of data sets that are used in building large language models as well. And then others have done sort of deep dives into more specific data sets or specific models that help both to surface issues, but also to help people understand and interpret how they can use a certain data set. To the next slide. So there's some precedent now for policies that are mandating transparency. So Eleanor talked earlier a little bit about these rulings on copyright court cases, but maybe familiar here in the UK. A recent development over the last year or so has been that in the public sector, they've been rolling out a mandate for public sector organizations to document how algorithmic tools are used. And this includes information about data sets that they're developing or using and who's responsible for those and how to learn more about those data sets. And there are also stipulations in the EUAI Act, so sort of mandating technical documentation of models, but also templated training data transparency that's aimed at the public, as well as reporting to the AI office and also to downstream providers. So we don't exactly know in terms of the EUAI Act exactly what this implementation will look like yet. And so we don't know what the templates will look like, but these policies should definitely mean some significant change to organizations' practices and to the level of transparency that's available. Next slide, please. So yes, somewhat separately to this kind of range of documentation approaches, there's also the kind of more technical field of explainable AI. And so XAI, as it's also known, is a field of research and practical approaches, as you can see here in this example, that are aiming to give people quite specific insights into why certain predictions or decisions have been made by a system. So there are a huge amount of different approaches within this more technical field, but in terms of practical applications, making this kind of usable for your average user, we're still figuring out how to do this well, essentially. And so, yeah, almost there. So this is essentially a summary of all of these different approaches that we've run through in hopefully quite a short space of time to leave some time for Ben to present as well. So yeah, we've talked a bit about this dependency. So to know about AI systems and models, there's also a need to have well-documented data sets and for for developers to be selecting well-documented data sets. And all of these different elements are kind of working together at the moment to change the landscape of what transparency is looking like, but kind of giving you this sense of what's being done. There's also a kind of emerging question that you may have already considered, given that we've already primed you to consider it, which is whether all of these different kind of standards and formats are actually producing transparency meaningfully, whether they're actually kind of making a difference, essentially. So I'll hand to Ben with that.
Thank you, Sophia. And we might as well go to the next one, Eleanor. Perfect. So kind of a quick then run through of where we are. So as we've heard from Eleanor and Sophia and everyone else, there's a general acceptance that transparency about the data sources, the data that makes up AI is a good thing. However, as Sophia said, so not all data sets are documented at all. So there's many things on Hugging Face that there's or not on Hugging Face that could be. When they are on some of these open repositories for transparency, they aren't necessarily documented thoroughly or consistently, and there's lots of research that points to the fields that are more filled than others. And then even when they are filled out, they are not necessarily, this transparency information is not necessarily tailored to all of the potential people, and I'll tell you about who those people could be later on, but they're not tailored to the various different kind of potential users of this data. So this leaves us in a kind of difficult position of advocating for transparency as a good thing, but because it's not being done well and meaningfully or consistently enough at the moment, we're unable to demonstrate the value of transparency and taking transparency approaches. And then this also then means that when we're looking at our wider picture then of transparency being the means to an end goal, so transparency being valuable so that we can make things better, so that issues can be resolved or kind of problems can be identified, that we're missing those kind of links in the chain to be able to get to that point and to demonstrate what we've got at the moment with transparency information, to be able to show that it's this valuable thing that we kind of believe in. Next slide, please, Eleanor. So we wanted to do some work to kind of help to fill some of these gaps. So our kind of core overarching questions then were, because we don't know whether transparency is working at the moment, we wanted to make sure we were asking the right kind of core questions. And this meant that we needed to know who the users are of data transparency, and we needed to know what their needs were and their purposes for using this information. We also then needed to match up what this information that would support them, what it looks like, how it could be provided, how their needs could be met through the supply of certain types of information. And then finally, we needed to assess whether or how AI model providers were meeting these standards, were meeting these needs of users. Next slide, please, Eleanor. So, and don't worry if you can't read this. This is a table from the report, which I'm sure Neil will post in the chat and we'll send around afterwards. Perfect timing. So we wanted to really focus in on this question of users. So we ran a period of expert interviews. We spoke to lots of experts. We ran a workshop with people from various different kind of policy, research, development points of view, and we reviewed existing literature. to pull together some kind of headline personas of the people who want to use data transparency. We talked to them about kind of what their purposes were, what their applications for using this information would be, and then, like I said before, we then matched up how this information could be provided by the model providers. And this is because, and you can see this in much more detail in our reports, is we wanted to make sure that when we talked about transparency, we were clear about transparency for whom. And as you can see in this, the needs of a data scientist or developer for understanding the data that makes up a model, or the data practices as part of a model, are significantly different to those of creatives who want to maybe be able to find out if their copyrighted work has been included in a model, or policymakers and regulators who want to ensure that certain kind of commitments are being met, or to understand the kind of supply chain of data that makes up their jurisdiction. So we wanted to kind of separate these personas and avoid some of the conflation where it might be. We've been transparent because we've shared all of this very meaningful information, but if it's not meaningful to the different types of people and their different needs, then it's probably not actually meaningful. Next slide, please, Eleanor. So, like I said, then we were looking to match up then these different needs with the information that could be provided, and came up with 8 core dimensions that came out of these assessments. So the dimensions were kind of relatively straightforward, and they're things that we would expect to become kind of standardized. Things like lists of data sets and the sources used in models, how this data was collected, information about the activities that took place in order to use that data set meaningfully in an AI model, whether some of these accessible documentation and transparency formats that Sophia described had been used, and then a couple of similar questions of points of clarity as to whether copyrighted and personal data was potentially included in the model, and the standards and the kind of approaches that were taken in order to check for it or mitigate from these kind of potential uses, or to justify if they had the licenses to be able to use this data, then making sure that that was abundantly clear to people reading it. And then a couple of points about the data supply chain. So both the humans that make up the supply chain. So there's lots of talk about labeling or the role of humans in training and fine-tuning AI models. And we were looking for documentation to say what their role was. Preferably it would include a list of the organizations they used, again, just so that this supply chain was transparent. And then likewise, looking for a connection between the data that was used and the size of models and the activities that took place, and assessments as to the environmental impacts of those data practices, which is something that is kind of growing as an expectation, that we get better at talking about lots of these different supply chain components, especially. Next slide, please, Eleanor. Perfect. So we then so we had these user personas, we had these kind of dimensions that we were looking for model providers to use. So then we needed to actually do some assessments. So we selected what was originally a set of 22 models. And the criteria for this selection was initially whether we were looking for organizations that had signed on to the voluntary UK Seoul agreement on a commitment to responsibility in AI development, and tying that to the kind of UK policy space. And then we also added models that had been assessed as at least partially meeting the open source AI definition. Again, if there is an expectation that a model is open, we wanted to see whether the extent to which that then translated into better transparency practices. So we used a maturity assessment to do this. So we, rather than just saying whether the information was shared or not, we were also asking about how it was shared, how easy it was to find, and how the extent to which it was explained to two main personas of the 8 or so that we selected. We wanted to focus initially on developers and responsible AI researchers. So how well would they be able to understand the data based on the information that was shared? The reason for choosing those personas was basically if things aren't being explained to them well and accurately and kind of with all the contextual information, then basically what hope do we have for the non-technical communities, the non-technical explanations, as what the people who are largely under kind of catered for within this information. So we wanted to start with hopefully some good news, and then future research would then begin picking that apart. Also, just to say, there is a separate blog post where we added DeepSeek to the assessment. Again, the claims of open source kind of dominated some of the initial DeepSeek news. We wanted again to kind of do the assessment for them. Next slide, please, Eleanor. I will try to go through the results as quickly as possible. So here you can see basically the spread. So these were the overall maturity scores based on the 23 models, because this has DeepSeek on, and how they were scored in total based on these 8 dimensions. You can see kind of quite clearly there's a real spread. So there's a really strong cluster in the low maturity and a number of model providers getting the lowest possible score. So basically very little commitment to transparency, very little commitment to kind of explaining this information. Kind of we would expect at least to see a technical paper that kind of explains some of this, and in some of these cases there was launches by blog posts, or there was only websites and no attempt to explain. We can see a decent range in the middle, and this is about probably where we'd expect people to be, which is, and I'll show you how it breaks down on the different metrics, but basically an inconsistency in approach. So explaining some of these things that we're asking for to a decent enough level, and either not explaining or not sharing the information for others. We would also expect these results to be obviously then different according to the different personas. I think also worth saying that these assessments were done based on the ability for the assessor to be able to find the information. If it was buried in 3 blog posts back and you had to know where to find it, etc., then we counted that as a poor transparency approach. Next slide, please, Eleanor. So this is a different way of breaking down then the information. You can see here with the pink squares being low maturity, orange being medium, and green being high, how well each of these models were performing based on these dimensions. You can see a general split with slightly higher on average maturity on the top 4 aspects, which was the list of the data sets, the collection methods, the activities that took place, and the use of transparency information, standardized transparency information. This is generally better documented and better maturity. And this is because, in all likelihood, of many of the developments that Sophia shared, that these are the things that have been standardized and adopted and have been pushed by the communities for a number of years now. So we can see here that that push is starting to sink in, and that many of these model providers are kind of getting better at documenting it. You can see some of the kind of best in class of IO and Pythia, and then some at the other side that were rated at low maturity. And then we can see the bottom 4 dimensions, which were the ones that are slightly newer in terms of documentation. Things like the energy usage is only really starting to be adopted kind of relatively recently. And the focus on copyrighted information has obviously kind of exploding based on the kind of swell of generative AI. So these are things that we would hope and expect that if we rerun this assessment in a year, in 2 years, that there would be much more kind of maturity in these, because we think things like the regulations in UK, Europe, etc., will be starting to filter through with kind of increased expectations on model providers to supply this information. So that's it from our kind of headline of results. I think overall you can see that there's kind of some good work taking place from some of these providers. You can see all of this broken down in much more in the report that Neil shared. And if nothing else, you get to see a nice visual demonstration of where the best practice is. Thank you very much. Happy to answer any questions on our findings.
Yes, thank you, Ben. We're going to have the chance to expand on some of these findings and the methods we have used in a short while. But let me just quickly walk you through what happens next in this project at the ODI. Based on this research, but also our experience and feedback we have received when designing the method and when discussing with those who have applied the method to carry out the assessments, we've issued in the report a set of recommendations. We, like many others, believe that having a gold standard for what good transparency looks like is very, very important. We have seen that variety in scores across half of the dimensions in our assessment, and for us that's also a sign that at least for some players who maybe are new to the field, who don't have large responsible AI teams in-house to work on this, there is some uncertainty about what they should publish. Besides, if you have an academic background, you would probably publish a technical paper, you would put it on a site like Archive, you would provide some information on Hugging Face or the site where you do the release. But beyond that, what are the sort of things that you should be thinking about? So that gold standard, both in terms of standardization, but also in terms of knowing what good enough looks like is quite important to advance the field as a whole. Minimum transparency standards will emerge, we believe. We've spoken about regulation. We expect a transparency summary template to be published in Europe in the next months. And we think it's really important to make sure that these standards are enforced and met, but also to constantly monitor how well that information, how useful, how meaningful that information is, because at the end of the day, we don't want those requirements to overly burden model providers, especially those who do not have the resources to do that. And in those areas that we call it pink is a very joyful color, but as a community, we need better ways to hold those developers accountable who could have done better. In terms of what we are going to work on next, we would welcome feedback on the dimensions of the assessment. Everything is open source, so if anyone wants to use the tool to do assessments or to analyze the data, there's many interesting questions we can imagine people would want to ask. Ben briefly mentioned that we've also included open models, whether that's open weights like DeepSeek or genuinely open source according to the open source initiative definition. The headline as discussed in the report is that some of the more open models didn't perform necessarily better on some dimensions than the proprietary one. So there's quite some variety there. But we would want to continue to do these analysis, and we would want to analyze not just the same models, but also new ones that are important and make an impact on the ecosystem. And we're working on an interactive tool to present the information where people can contribute their own audits and also comment on some of those assessments. And among those people, we also hope that developers would engage with us to tell us when we haven't got things right, or when something that we have said or done has led to a change in how they do things. And with that, I hope you enjoyed the presentation. I've seen already some questions coming in, and I'm going to filter them a little bit just to make sure that we have the chance to cover as many topics as possible. So I'm going to start with one that refers to the method itself, method of assessment. Was there anything included regarding the funders of the data systems and processing methods? Ben, would you like to try to answer that?
So the easy answer is no. I think it's something that I would want to come out also in the kind of supply chain question is I see when Eleanor was talking about kind of the potential future of the transparency index, I think one way it could go would be kind of looking to replicate some supply chain transparency portals that are already out there, so that you can follow some of these kind of either relationships or the flow of data from the top to the bottom of the supply chain, or bottom to the top. And in that, you would then be able to kind of look at some of the kind of commonality in terms of where some of the data sets originally came from, how they were collected, who funded and kind of sourced those data sets. Because I think these assessments were done in isolation of one another by different people, which helped, but also then meant that we couldn't necessarily draw the connections between some of these questions. But yeah, future, hopefully.
A very interesting topic, and data provenance as such is obviously going to become more and more important now that we're running out of public data. Ben, don't mute yourself, because next question goes to you as well. So just very, very quickly, there was a question about whether there was a difference depending on where the model provider was based. So we looked at models from all over the world, anything that we could notice.
Again, so not enough for us to draw the trends, because there was 22 to 23 models included. We wanted to make sure that the models we assessed were from a kind of more diverse range of kind of origin countries, and that also reflected the range of kind of countries that were reflected in the UK Seoul Agreement. So not enough for a trend. So in some of those cases, like the UAE, I think had 1 or 2 models. China, we had 2 or 3. South Korea, we had 1. So yeah, not enough for a trend, but is something that we would want to build out again in what if we add more model providers to this assessment, then we can start to conduct that type of assessment, and it's something that we will be working on with kind of students as well who are interested in this data.
Yes, so if there's any students in the webinar, if you know any students looking for a project, we already have a few from our partner universities, but we always welcome more. I'm going to ask one more very interesting question. I wish I would have thought about all these things, or we would have thought about all these things when we were designing the work, but you know, next iteration. So many AI companies make a living reusing and refining existing models. So that may include additional training, modifications of the model. Does the work include or intends to cover additional training modifications that occur on top of the foundational models? Ben, Sophia, do you want to? Sophia, are you okay to do that? Yeah.
An answer for the research that I did
Yes.
earlier on. Ben, you might have an answer for this index work. So when I was doing some earlier research, I thought about this as well, and it was based on the updates primarily. But it was a challenge in terms of making the differentiation when doing the analysis. But I think that there being more clarity about those basic models, so your ChatGPT, for example, and where they are at in terms of transparency, and then being able to kind of combine the findings basically between the two to identify basically to understand both of those layers of transparency and where the problem might lie. I think it's something that's important.
Thank you.
And
yeah, Ben?
sorry, I was just going to go from the transparency index side. I think firstly refer to my previous answer on supply chains. So hopefully we would be able to kind of link and connect to kind of use and reuse. And then secondly, I think we also, like Sophia was alluding to, we want to make sure that those reusers are also documenting what they're doing and the decisions that were made, because it won't be a natural kind of easy fit port over and then we're using it. So they are also potentially augmenting it with their own data supply, etc. We want that to be documented as well, because we saw with even just some of the updated models, so kind of version 5 of an open model, some of their technical papers would be like, refer back to version 3, and you look at version 3 and they say refer back to version 1, and basically the obscurity of trying to find this information just means that it's really difficult to do. So we want good documentation standards dependent on independent of what version or whether it's been documented before, because people might be coming to it new.
Thank you. I'm going to answer the next one because it's quick. Is there a correlation between maturity score and the AI model effectiveness? So we didn't look at this. It's a very interesting question. My follow-up question would be performance of the model on what task? Because lots of these models, especially the ones that we have looked at, are foundational models, so you can apply them on various tasks. So would need to think about, consider that, but very, very interesting. So we've already mentioned openness as one dimension to look at, to look for correlations with, and there's model performance as well. Excellent suggestion. Thank you very much. Is there any work done on the roles of data stewards or data owners within the transparent AI data lifecycle? So this is to me, this goes now into the area of how do we make this work? How do we really produce better transparency, have better practices, and make something useful when this information is available? So, Sophia, do you want to try first? So, what should be the role of data stewards or owners in transparency assessment?
I think there's quite a lot of work still to be done to figure that out. I think that's it was something Ben and I were talking about the other day, actually, that there's not a huge amount of research sort of taking the practical perspective of people generating transparency information. Were you wanting to come in, Ben?
Only once you were finished. So I think Eleanor can talk about kind of documentation standards, etc., that can help this data to be found so that it can then be used in AI models. But I think beating the same drum again, but transparency about supply chains and data origins, so the list of data set sources, if these model providers were sharing kind of where they were getting this information from and the kind of agreements that they went into or the techniques they used to be able to assess in order to be able to access this data, then that is transparency about the data stewards from one side. So we would expect there to be a degree of transparency, particularly as things like copyright, so the current UK policy consultation, there's talk about kind of the role of third parties in being able to manage the copyright data or copyrighted data for the use of AI. So we expect, as there is a growth of these intermediaries that kind of steward this data and then it is used in AI systems, that there will be more of them and therefore more of a need for them to be transparent about the kind of agreements that they're in or what models that the data is providing.
Thank you. So we're unfortunately almost at the end, but I will combine two last questions that are in the same space around enforcing transparency requirement, using transparency. So there was a question or a comment about the fact that there is a tendency in this race that some of the AI providers have locked into to try to move as fast as possible, and with that perhaps a desire not to be burdened by any additional requirements to slow them down, to disclose some of the, to shed light on some of the practices, and with that, what does this mean for transparency, and for the work that we and others have done? So we think, and the analysis is actually showing that not everyone is, with very few exceptions in that assessment, model providers do share information, and they share that information because they want developers and other stakeholders to be able to use those models and understand what they have done. So it's a question of how much information is needed for what purposes. It would also be interesting to see how that evolves in time, but if we're comparing it to some other assessments that had a different focus that were done a few years ago, those 4 dimensions where lots of the models actually achieved very high scores, models that came from smaller teams that have to manage their resources very carefully, show that this makes business sense. And I'd love for someone to do an analysis of downloads or other scores and KPIs, usage KPIs and impact KPIs, just like we were talking earlier about model performance. We at the ODI will always advocate for meaningful transparency, relating to a question that was asked as well in the chat. And with that, I think I will wrap us up, but not before reminding you that you can subscribe to our newsletter to stay in touch with all the work that we are doing. This is the first time, as I was saying at the beginning, that we're presenting our own work on the webinar. Here, most recently, a piece of work related to transparency and its relation and impact on trust, that was produced by the ODI team in a related program on privacy enhancing technology, with some interesting, I think, results. And I will wrap up with the announcement for our next webinar. So we are very happy to welcome Pierre-Carl Langlais, who is co-founder of a French company called Playas. They did something that many people said can't be done, and that was to train very high performance large language models purely with open data. And by that, we don't mean public data that you can just find somewhere online, but open data according to the open data definition. So stay tuned. Do register. It's on the 19th of March, so exactly in 1 month. And I hope to see many of you there again. Thank you very much. Goodbye.